Now, our guest speaker today, a very special man indeed, and I might be slightly biased because I've had the privilege of working with him in supporting some of the work he's trying to achieve. Chris Burns, CRC. Firstly, would you all please stand? So, Rotarians and guests, who in your lives have you observed or have impacted upon your life as a friend or a family member or colleague who in the last 12 months or 2 years has had a mental health issue? If you don't know anyone, please sit down. Would you all please take a look? It affects us all. Thank you. You can be seated. Some 12 months ago, Chris Burns was appointed to the role of Commissioner of the South Australian Mental Health Commission. It was a new role. Through his life career, Chris has been well equipped to undertake this vital work. He was a legatee as a very young boy. He was educated in the UK. That followed a lengthy career as a leader in the Australian Army, with leadership roles in Syria, Iraq and the Gaza Strip. He has led SA Veteran Health Advisory Council and also was the CEO for Defence Training Centre for many years before taking up this role. Chris has extensive experience working with veterans experiencing post-traumatic stress disorder, which has encouraged him to apply for that role, which he is undertaking now. Over the last 12 months, mental health has been in the news, probably more than we had ever anticipated, and perhaps for Chris a little bit more disruptive than he would have hoped to do what he wants to achieve. I'm not going to steal Chris's thunder, but one of the stats is quite confronting. 1 in 5 Australians have experienced a mental disorder in the last 12 months. In the last 12 months. Would you please welcome to address us here today?
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think I've got the technology right there. Hang on, I've got to turn this on as well. Thank you very much for the opportunity to come along and speak to this august group today, particularly as it is Mental Health Week and yesterday was International Mental Health Day. Firstly, an apology. Clearly I got the name wrong. It should be the Rotary Club of Adelaide, so I do apologise for that. As Elizabeth said, my background is in defence. But I was very much involved with veterans and commanded soldiers in a variety of circumstances and saw them experience many forms of mental illness, not just PTSD. When I left the Army, I realised many of my friends were in fact suffering quite severely, and I was quite concerned at how they were being treated or not so well treated. So that developed my passion around veterans' mental health and has led me to the position where I'm at. So, as Elizabeth said, it was about 12 months ago I took on the role of the South Australian Mental Health Commissioner. The Commission is new. It was formed only in October 2015. When I moved into the role, the first 2 questions I got asked by journalists were, do we have enough mental health acute beds? And why do mentally ill people spend so much time in emergency departments? Being ever knowledgeable about the subject, I said on both accounts, I don't know. But if that's the prism that you're looking at mental health through, then you're really focusing on mental illness and not total mental health and well-being. Now, that drove me to look at what are the statistics for mental illness in our society. And I hope you can see that chart there. But that basically indicates that it's less than 8% of the population will require that severe acute spectrum of mental health services. But our focus tends to be on those services, and when we talk about mental health, we just talk about mental illness. That led me to think, well, why don't we take a bit more of an actuarial look at this? How can we impact the whole society here in South Australia rather than just focusing on the delivery of mental health services? And when you look at the statistics, 60-odd% of people are well. But you have 23% who are at risk and just under 10% who have some form of mild mental illness. But we're not doing any work in that bottom end of the triangle. We're focusing on the top end. And I was struck by a quote by the Prime Minister at the awarding of the inaugural National Mental Health Awards in August last year. And he highlighted that it's a huge cost to the nation in every respect, and I'll talk a bit more in detail about that later. I think he got the speech wrong there. I think he should have spoken about measuring it in terms of human happiness first before you start measuring it in terms of dollars. And he highlighted that we all have a vested interest in the mental health and well-being of every Australian. And I think the last sentence there is what really triggered me, this concept of the mental wealth of our nation. If we focused on how do we build our mental wealth, we might have a more holistic perspective and approach to mental health and well-being. So as I said, the Commission was raised in October 2015, and I was tasked with, my role was to drive the reform of mental health services in South Australia. We're a new government agency, and that has been an absolute pleasure in the last 12 months, establishing a new agency of government. And I joke, it's been quite an ordeal setting up a new agency of government whilst we've been addressing this. But I was able to go back to the Minister very early and say, I can't reform the mental health services in South Australia because I don't own them. That presumes that the problem is the mental health services and that they are in need of reform. I want to take a more holistic view of mental health in South Australia. So we revised the role of the Commission to being one of strengthening the mental well-being of South Australians. And that comes back to that more holistic and actuarial approach. How do we impact the whole of society? So with that as our role, the key task given to the Commission was to develop a strategic plan, a mental health strategic plan for South Australia. We're on the cusp of producing that, and that should be hopefully out by the end of this year. Losing a health minister and a mental health minister recently just hasn't helped that process. So if we're going to talk about mental wellbeing, we better define and understand what mental wellbeing is. And so we got out there and we spoke to a lot of people, not just clinicians, but those in the broader community. And we realised that actually mental wellbeing is about the whole of person. That you can't talk about mental health and mental illness and mental well-being if you're only looking at the psychological parts of it. That you can't really be physically fit if you're not mentally fit. And you can't be mentally well if you don't have a good society around you, if you're not living in a good environment, if you don't have some sense of spirituality, and if you don't have those economic supports that you need. And in essence, if a person knows that they've got a roof over their head tonight, that they're going to get a good meal, that they've got the capacity to generate revenue, and they've got family and community around them, they're in a very good position to have good mental health and well-being. But when one of those pillars breaks down, then you start going down that slippery slope to mental ill health. So when we talk about mental health and well-being, it's in that context of the whole of person. The next thing we looked at was the whole of life. And it's got to be from preconception right through to end of life. And there's some pretty stark statistics around that. And this is what really impacted me right from the start. 45% of Australians will at some point in their life experience a diagnosable mental illness. And that to me is staggering, almost half of us. So the next statistic I made up because I like to do that. If 45% are going to experience a diagnosable mental illness, then 55% of Australians are going to be impacted by it. You can't avoid it. And Elizabeth's exercise at the start was a classic example. We are all impacted by someone who is experiencing a mental illness at some point in our lives. In fact, it'll probably be multiple times. At any point in time, and as Elizabeth said, 1 in 5 or 20% of people are experiencing a mental illness. But the kicker is that 65% of those who do experience a diagnosable mental illness can't or won't access the supports and the medical health services they need to help them. And this is a great audience because 66% of that 65% are old buggers like me, old blokes who are too proud to put their hand up and say, hey, I'm a bit wobbly, I need a hand. What really impacts is when you look at the early in life part of life, it's particularly the early years. The next statistic that really struck me was that 50% of diagnosable mental illness onsets before the age of 14. That's not just a statistic out of the air, it's proven over and over again, particularly between the ages of 11 and 14. As a father and a grandfather, that's quite riveting to me. Worse still, 75% by the age of 24. So that says to me, if we're not looking at youth, at children and their mental health and well-being, we're missing the opportunity. The human brain starts to develop 3 weeks after conception, and 80% of brain development has occurred by the age of 4. So you shape the mental health and well-being of kids in that first 4 years of life. You have the opportunity to prevent the onset of mental illness, or 50% of mental illness, before 14 and 75% by 24. So that is driving our thinking. How do we help these kids and the parents through the transition points? Mental illness is generally associated with some form of trauma, and we associate trauma with being something like a car accident or a horrific situation. For young ones, going to preschool is a traumatic event. It's separation from the parent. Going from preschool to primary is a traumatic event. The most traumatic event for kids, especially in that 11 to 14 age group, is the transition from primary to secondary school. And just to add a bit there, we throw a little puberty in there, and it really upsets the apple cart. So that's when our kids are most vulnerable, and we've got to be supporting them and helping them as much as possible. There's some great work going on out there in schools by extremely well-meaning teachers who are taking on the extra burden of teaching their young kids resilience and mindfulness, giving them the toolkits and the tools they need to get through their daily life. And it's just amazing when you go out and talk to the kids how much they value that toolkit. You know, talking to young girls who say, when I go home at night, my brothers drive me crazy, and I used to argue and fight with them. But now I know what my tools are. I know to go and read a book. I know to go and listen to music. I know not to fight them. So we need to get some consistency about building resilience in our youth. When I first started in this job, they said, could you do a video for Are You OK Day? And sort of like being the macho ex-army officer I was, I said, got to admit, I've always been scared of Are You OK Day? Because I always wondered if I asked the question, what if I got the answer is, oh, well, I'm really feeling bad, actually, and because I didn't know how to deal with it. I didn't know what the answers were. So I admitted that, and they said, well, you need to go and do a mental health first aid course. Show of hands, how many have heard of a mental health first aid course? Okay. I wish I'd done it 30 years ago, because I would have done a whole lot of things different in my life, both personally and professionally, if I'd had the benefit of that 2 days. I don't think it was around 30 years ago, but It doesn't teach you how to triage. It's not like a St John's first aid. It empowers you with the knowledge. What are the different forms of mental illness? How do you recognise it? And most importantly, you know how to ask the question, are you okay? And if they say, I'm really feeling bad, you say, okay, let's sit down and talk about this. Have you had thoughts of taking your own life? Now, I would never have done that before I did that course. But 5 times since I have done that course, I've had cause to ask a person, have you had thoughts of taking your own life? So simple things like how do we give mental health first aid courses to our kids in schools? How do we make them strong so that they survive these traumatic years and we prevent that onset of mental illness before age 24? The prevalence of mental illness does decrease with age, but it is most prevalent in that 18 to 24 bracket. And then, I'm sorry, the worst statistic. Highest cause of death in the age group 15 to 24 is suicide. 12 months ago when I started talking about this subject, that percentage was 26%. The report came out the other day, it's now at 30%. Now, if you know anything about it, the criteria to determine actual suicide is quite tight, and there has to be a clear indication that it was a definite suicide. The second greatest cause of death in that age group, anyone want to have a guess? Car accidents. And what is staggering is the number that are in young men in the 20 to 30 age group, and the number of those accidents that are single vehicle, single occupancy. So the stats could be worse. So how do we stop that horrible, horrible carnage happening in our youth? And these are the things we as a community have to start addressing. Mental well-being is about whole of government. You can't just keep saying, oh yeah, mental health, that's SA Health, that's their problem. It's not. It's a federal issue, it's a state issue, and it's a local government issue. And it's not just an agency of government, it's every agency of government. More particularly, it's around the education department, community and social inclusion. It's about corrections and police and first responders. So we have to get that whole of government approach. And most importantly, it's about the whole community. As I said, if there's a community surrounding these people, if they're getting that social support from their community and their families, then their chances of surviving and not falling into severe mental illness are much greater. We went out and we spoke to South Australians and we asked them what's their experience with mental illness, and we listened to them and we consulted them. And it was interesting, the first response we got in most cases is that they're sick of being consulted about and nothing happening. They're sick of being consulted about mental health and not being listened to. So hopefully we have listened to them, and people very generously shared their stories and their ideas and their thoughts. And we opened it up to, you can tell us your story in any way you like. And so people sent us emails. People came along and talked to us. People came to community workshops. People sent us artworks. They sent us cartoon books. They sent us magazines. We got one lovely letter from a lady who said, thank you for so much for putting a postal address, because I don't have a computer and I don't do emails, but I can write a letter. And she wrote us a lovely letter giving us her perspective. So we really got some good input from South Australians. In fact, we have formally had 2,200 South Australians talk to us, and we had 900 people do a survey, which is pretty good. What I'd like to do now is quickly surmise by giving an indication of what were the key themes that came out of our conversations and consultations that are informing the strategic plan that we've drafted. And I think our first thoughts were that what we would hear from them is, oh, the medical health services are terrible. We can't find the right services. There's not enough psychologists. There's not enough psychiatrists. You can't get help when you need it. Interestingly, that wasn't the case. We identified what we thought were the key issues, produced a discussion paper and put it back out and said, look, you said we don't listen to you. Here's what we think we heard. Tell us, did we get it right or did we get it wrong? And while you're giving us that feedback back, can you tell us what's the priority? What do you think is the most important thing we should be looking at? Now, we got 500 responses to that survey, so that's pretty good feedback given that we had 900 survey responses earlier. The first and foremost and the highest priority by a clear margin was that we have to expend more effort in the promotion, prevention and early in life intervention. And that goes back to that point I was making about how do we stop these young people getting mentally ill? How do we encourage workplaces to think of the mental health of their workplace as much as they think of the physical health of their workplace? People don't realise, employers, and Elizabeth and I have had personal experience with this, we organised a lunch earlier this year where we got in the community and industry leaders to give them an insight of what the prevalence of mental illness is in the community, what their obligations are and what the cost to them was. And I had the managing director of a defence company employing over 250 people come up to me before the lunch and said, "G'day mate, good to see you again. Don't know why I'm here." He said, "But free lunch Adelaide Oval, I know Burnsy, he's a good mate, I'll catch up with him." He said, "But this mental health thing is not an issue. We don't employ mentally ill people." And I said, "Well, how about you just sit down and listen to the lunch and I want to talk to you at the end of it." Before the lunch ended, he came up to me and said, "Mate, I can't hang around. I've got to get back to work. We don't have any mental health policies in my workplace and I need to start working on it now." That's the sort of thing we've got to get out there, is how do we get workplaces thinking of it? How do we look after our older people? They still need to be looked after from a mental health perspective. They still need to learn that resilience so that they can go through those transition points later in life. We need to raise our community education and awareness. That's the only way we're going to reduce stigma. We have to get people talking about this. It has to be the discussion at the table, around dinner table each night. People shouldn't be afraid to put their hand up and say, "Hey, I've got a problem." And people should be prepared to sit down and listen to them without judging and be prepared to help people. We need to integrate our services. There's a lot of duplication going on out there in terms of the delivery of services, and we need to get those services working better together. And people need to be accessed the right care at the right time at the right place. A simple example was out in the country where we fly in and fly out psychologists and psychiatrists, I should say. They said, "Look, we know we can't have our own psychiatrist and you're going to fly one in every 3 weeks to have a look at us, but could you send the same one so we don't have to keep telling the same story?" And services that better meet people's needs, give people's options, give them alternatives. There are groups in our population that do need targeted response, and I don't need to go through those groups, and we need to be giving care that's relevant to their situation. And finally, we have to become better at planning, funding and monitoring the performance of all the services that help people with mental illness, mental health and mental wellbeing. But all of that has led us to this is where it sticks. I'll keep going, hopefully. Come on, you can do it. There we go. That's the vision for our strategic plan going forward. It's about being a resilient, compassionate and connected community. It talks about the 4 whole ofs I went through with you. It's about building, sustaining and strengthening the mental health and wellbeing of South Australians, and it's all about growing our state's mental wealth. So that's where we are as a commission at the moment. That's what we've learned. I hope it's given you insight. Things like Rotary are so important. That's community. And community is the best way that we can support people to be strong in their mental health and wellbeing. Again, I thank you for the opportunity to talk today, and I'm happy to, I don't know if we go through questions or what.
Just to Giuliano.
Thank you, Chris. I was going to ask you that lady, but I think I'm not sure the question was there lady, but my question is, have you met Jill, obviously you knew Jill Chapman that we were meeting today an absolute coincidence. We are thinking of working in partnership with Mosh on this project and to support them to realize some of the things that they want to do. Do you know the organization? And can you just give us some feedback or comment on that?
Jill and I just met today. But I did have a chance to have a good talk to Jill about Mosh. And that's a standout example of community, of volunteers running op shops, that not being discriminatory about who they help, being able to help people, looking for options to get, they've set up 2 facilities now, looking at getting out into the community. This is the epitome of how you address mental health and wellbeing in the community, is get out there into the community and have willing volunteers. I'm not sure that they should always be volunteers, actually. I think there's a place for what's called a peer support workforce, and that's a workforce where people with lived experience are trained, are credentialed, have a career structure, because there's nothing better than someone who's experiencing mental illness to have someone who's had that lived experience sit down next to them and say, hey, I know how you got here, I've been through what you've been through before, let's just sit and talk about how you did get here and what we can do going forward, especially in places like emergency departments. So I would support Jill 100%.
Thanks, Chris. In a land a long while ago, to get journalists, I was told not to mention suicide.
Yeah.
And not to report it. And here, I think, probably the same someone who's contemplating. And for all those years since I was a journalist, I think we sort of kept a blind eye to it. I sense nowadays there's a more mature approach to suicide and reporting. Is that correct? And what is the best? What is that better way of managing that issue so that we can start those conversations?
Absolutely. It's about talking about it. Don't be afraid to talk about suicide. Don't be afraid to talk about mental illness. The prevalence is there. We all are impacted by it. The one question you should always ask is, if you think someone is contemplating suicide, ask them, are you contemplating taking your own life? Because if they are, they'll tell you straight away. And they'll be so grateful that someone finally asked them the question and they didn't have to put their hand up. The general philosophy is, yes, please talk about it. But if you do talk about it, understand how to help them, where to refer them for support. Your first port of call is get them to their GP. But there are some amazing support mechanisms on the internet at the moment. But the most important thing is to sit them down. Don't ask them what their problem is. Ask them what happened to get to where you are now. And how are we going to help you through this? It's good to have a cup of coffee. Now we need to take you to a GP. Okay?
Thank you, Chris, and we'll leave it there, otherwise we'll be running over time. Chris, this pen has a light, an interesting concept. Thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure we all appreciate it. So when you stand, perhaps there's one message I can leave you with. Remember, your mental health is just as important as your physical health. So please go and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, Chris.